Would you please turn with me to Psalm 47? Psalm 47 and verse 4. Psalm 47 and verse 4. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved. Selah. In other words, pause and think about that. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved. Sometimes the Psalms have to do with a particular occasion that we know about. They're linked to an event, a particular time in the history of David's life or the history of Israel as a nation. And we know that the psalm was composed at such a time as that. We don't know when this psalm was composed. People have conjectured as to when that might have been, but what seems quite certain is that it was composed at a time of great national triumph and rejoicing. Look at verse 1. "O clap your hands, all ye people, shout unto God with the voice of triumph." So it seems to be composed at a time when for Israel some victory had been won in battle and great things had been accomplished by the grace of God. And it's a time, therefore, when the heart is full and faith is strong. Verses 2 and 3. "The Lord Most High is terrible. He is a great king over all the earth. He shall subdue the people under us and the nations under our feet." And you can well imagine that verse 3 would have been written at a time then when Israel as a nation had won some great military victory. He shall subdue the people under us and the nations under our feet. And then when you come into verse 4, you have an expression of confidence about the future. "He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved." Confidence about the future, because at a time when God has so wonderfully appeared for Israel, it seems freshly certain that all things are in the hands of this great and gracious God, and the Lord will choose the future blessing, the future course of his people. And this rises as the verse goes on. "He shall choose our inheritance for us, that which is to come, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved." And of all the patriarchs, Jacob was the one who was most directly blessed, of course, because he was the father of the 12 sons who became whose names bore the names of the tribes and so forth. And it was Jacob that was renamed Israel, and it's his name that was handed down through the generations. And so you might well argue that Jacob was signally, wonderfully blessed. And the psalmist writes here that he shall choose our inheritance for us, meaning, as he goes on, even to the extent and along the same lines and to the same level that Jacob knew. And of course Jacob was the usurper. Jacob was undeserving, and yet look at what Jacob received by blessing from the Lord. "He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved." And that's why the Lord did so much for Jacob. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the future of Israel. Well, that leads us to a question. Who will choose our inheritance? Who will choose our future, our lot in days to come, whether it be in life or in eternity? There are two options, really. It amounts to that. Will we trust ourselves to choose wisely, to choose well? Or will we trust God to do the choosing for us? You see, when the psalmist writes this, that is not written out of a sense of reluctance, or "he shall choose our inheritance, we've got no say in the matter, we wish we did." but we have to leave it in the hands of God. This is gladness. This is joyfulness. He shall choose our inheritance for us. The God who's done great things for us in the past, well, what a wonderful thing. How happy we should be. He's going to choose the future for us. Our inheritance is all in his hands, and he will appoint what that might be and how things will work out. Well, where do we stand with this? Will we trust ourselves to choose wisely, or do we think of the Lord and say, well, we'd rather he did it. We'd rather he choose our inheritance for us. As I say, this expresses confidence to trust him. It's a glad heart that says these things. And that must be the case, and it would be the case for us if only we were to realize that he is infinitely more capable of making good choices than we would ever be. Jacob, whom he loved, comes at the end of the verse. And that really undergirds everything else. The love of God toward us is an everlasting love. It's a profound love. It's a constant love. And it's a love that desires two things for us. In essence, his love desires to turn us into the best person it is possible to be. And that's what's needed. It's not just our environment and our circumstances around us that make the difference. It's what we are that really counts. And that's the purpose of the Lord, to turn us into the best persons it is possible for us to be. And that's all grounded in the love of God. And the second aspect is then, having done that, he would set us in the best place that it's possible for us to be in. And we'll think about that in just a moment or two. But just let us have that settle in our minds for a moment. He loves us, and therefore what a thing it is to trust someone whose love is so deep and profound and constant. We're not trusting in a God who is fickle or a God who is indifferent toward us. We're trusting ourselves into the hands of a God who loves everlastingly and unchangeably. So there's one reason for being glad of his choice for our inheritance. But a second reason is that not only is he a God of great and eternal love, but he's a God of infinite wisdom. Wisdom. He knows what the best of all possibilities actually is for us. And he knows and is able to devise a way of attaining that for us. He knows what needs to be done, and he knows how to do it. Now you compare that to us and what we know. Well, we know so very little. We can't foretell the future. Compare what God knows and what God can work out with our puny ideas about what is best. We've only got to look back over our lives, and we can probably well remember certain things that we have worked out and decided and thought to ourselves, well, if I do that, if I work out things this way, then nothing could possibly go wrong. And yet it did. And it proves, doesn't it, that we just know so very little. And yet we come to the Lord, and does he make mistakes? Is he limited in his understanding? Are there hidden surprises down the road for him? Not at all. Not at all. He's infinitely wise. But not only that, he's infinitely mighty. Those things that he plans and appoints for us, that are for our good, worked out on the basis of his love, well, he's got such power that he's able to bring it all into effect, and nothing can ever stand in his way to obstruct him and thwart his purposes. That's not like us. We can make our plans, things happen, and we just can't accomplish what we intended. But that's never the case with the Lord. He knows how, and he has the power to accomplish these things. Now, our plans are frequently overturned by things that are completely beyond our control. Is anything beyond the control of God? Of course it isn't. It can't possibly be. And yet the surprising thing is that in spite of all that we know theoretically, about the superior love and wisdom and power of God, we still think we know best and that we can work things out. It's quite remarkable how that what we know to be a fact can have so little impact upon the way that we actually live and commit ourselves to the future. He shall choose. We're glad of that, or we ought to be so glad of that. Our inheritance, though, what is it that God will choose for us? We're thinking about the future. Inheritance is about future, and I want to speak about this in three ways. I'm going to start at the end, the final state of heaven. That really has got to be the ultimate in terms of an inheritance. The final state of heaven, God will choose that for us. God will also choose the means of obtaining a place in heaven. And then God will also choose the path that we take before we reach that place of heaven. So we're thinking about those three things. The final state of heaven, first of all. But what is heaven? What will we choose heaven to be or to be like? Well, judging by the things that a lot of people say, and I'm not talking only about people out there in the world that haven't got the first idea about what the Bible actually teaches, I would think that many a Christian has got very small views, very low views of the glories and the wonders of heaven. And if it were left to us, we would rack our brains and we would sit down and we would think to ourselves, well, this has got to be the best. This has got to be how it ought to be. It couldn't possibly be better than this because we can't imagine how it could be. And yet you know that if we were to choose what heaven would be like, it would be far, far inferior to what God has chosen it to be like. It will be without sin altogether. Isn't that a great thought? Isn't it our sin that gets us down? Isn't it our sin that has crippling effects upon us, the way that we think and the way that we live? Isn't it sin that damages us in our experiences here in this present world? And our feelings and our emotions are all affected by these things, and yet so much of what is sin is what we want. And to think that heaven would have any place for such a thing as that would be such a wrong and a low estimate of the heavenly state. And yet we have these strange views at times, where if it's without sin, it therefore is a place and state of absolute righteousness. Now, people in the world don't think very much of that, but you see, God knows far better than we do. Righteousness is a wonderful thing. To live righteously is the most exalted way that anybody could live. And to think that heaven will be an eternal state of nothing but righteousness. Nothing but righteousness. Nothing but godlikeness. You see, that's what the Lord has planned in his wisdom, and we must be very thankful that he's chosen something that is far better than we would ever choose for ourselves. Being righteous and surrounded by righteousness. That's all that heaven will be. And knowing and experiencing the Lord in far greater ways than we do now. That's what the Lord has chosen for heaven. To be near him, to see him, to be like him, to have fellowship with him, never interrupted, never spoiled, never dragged away from his presence, never banished from his presence because of our sin and all the rest, but with him and enjoying his presence and fellowship with him in degrees and in ways that are far beyond our imagining. And when you put all of this together, you have a place and an experience and a state where there are degrees of happiness and contentment and satisfaction that we would never, ever imagine could be possible. Now, if we would design a heaven, it might well be better than this present earth, but it would never be what God has designed for us. eye hath not seen, neither hath it entered into the heart of man, and so on. It really is far better than we could ever devise or even imagine. Aren't we therefore glad of the superior choice of God for our final inheritance? Far better than we would ever choose for ourselves. But what about the way of getting there, the means of arriving in heaven there? Well, he chooses that too. It's all included. And it must be like that. See, left to us, we probably come to the conclusion that there's no issue that, well, we're all going there, aren't we? That's what the world says, we're all going there, apart from some few people who are notorious in their sins, in their crimes, in the corruption of their nature. But generally, by and large, everyone's going there. That's the kind of message that seems to be about. They've got this funny view of heaven, and they've got a very odd view as to how anybody would get there. But really, it's not an issue. Why wouldn't we arrive there, most people would say. And people think like that, of course, because they have no idea of the real facts of the matter. That in order to enter into heaven, you have to be right with God. You have to be accepted by God. And to be right with God, you have to be like God. And absolutely so. And we're far from that. And we need to understand that. And therefore, left to ourselves and our own devices, there's no heaven for us. We're banned from the place, banished forever. And left to us, if we were to make our choice, we would probably choose just to fall back upon our own strength, because we think that we can make things right. And we can get there by our own will and under our own steam. Maybe we can change a bit. Maybe we can improve our lives a little bit and do some good works to make up for the bad things. Well, if that's the way that we choose, we would fail absolutely and completely. And therefore God steps in with his choice. This is the way. He knows our inability, and he takes pity upon us in his immeasurable and infinite love. And his choice is to step into the world in the person of his Son and do it all for us, to make us fit, to send his Son that he might be our Saviour, that he might bear our sin, that he might make us right, that we might therefore be qualified to enter into heaven. You see the difference? Our choice, well, if there's an issue, we can work it out. We can get there ourselves. God is bound to accept us in the end. Well, that's a foolish choice. That will never work. But God's choice is to recognize our inability and therefore to send his Son that he might do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And that's the whole point, of course, of Calvary and the sufferings of Jesus, to bear our sins in his own body, that we might then be forgiven as we trust our souls into his hands. So there's a choice that God makes for us, and it's for us to trust in his choice, not relying upon what we do, what we can make efforts toward, but to trust in God's choice. If it's God's choice, by faith in Jesus Christ, it must be a choice that is right. A choice, if I can put it very bluntly and in ordinary language, it's a choice that works. It brings us salvation. It brings us to heaven. Our choice won't, but his most certainly will. But then also, the inheritance of God is not only a matter of the heaven at the end and the means of arriving there and being qualified for it, but also the choice of the path we should take here in this present world. The future of our lives in this world is all included in this great matter. He shall choose our inheritance for us. He steps in, as it were, to choose the way that our lives work out, the experiences, the joys, the sorrows, whatever it might be. He chooses the path that we should take. Now, our choice, if we were to make our choice, it's fraught with problems. We make our decisions about one thing and another, and to live like that is fraught with problems, even as a child of God, we might say. We want to make our own way. We think that that's freedom. We want to make our own choices. We think that that's liberty. And if we were to choose in detail, what we would probably want to settle on is a pretty well carefree life, full of disappointments, full of sorrows, full of upsets, instead a life that's full of pleasant experiences and successes where all our dreams are fulfilled and realized. That's what we'd like it to be. Whereas the Lord chooses something rather different from that, as experience proves. Yes, there are joys. Yes, there are many, many blessings. Yes, there are many good things that the Lord gives us freely to enjoy in this present life. But the Lord chooses for us things that we would never, ever want to choose for ourselves. The very things that we would want to avoid. Upsets, setbacks, trials, tribulations, burdens, cares, troubles. These things are the choice of God. He shall choose our inheritance for us. And we might say, well, why? Why is that a good choice? Why is it that the Lord chooses for us that we should have lives like that and not just sail through and then pass serenely into heaven at the end? Why all these troubles and upsets and so on? Well, we must understand that these things are chosen by him deliberately. It's not that God is, as it were, removed from his throne and these things come in against his will. They're chosen deliberately. They're chosen also lovingly. We looked at this not so long ago, but they're chosen in love. God doesn't love one day and therefore bless us and not love us the next day and therefore allow unhappy things to come our way. It's not like that. All the events of our lives are chosen deliberately and lovingly, and they're chosen purposefully. And why is that? What has the Lord got in mind? If he wants the best for us, what is it that the Lord has in mind in allowing these unhappy experiences to come our way? Well, it's to make us people who live by faith, that we may honour him. And that's the way that we ought to be, to live by faith. We ought to have explicit and unbounded faith in God, simply to trust him no matter what. That's how we ought to be. And in the goodness of God, that's how God desires us to become. He also designs that we may feel our dependence upon him, that we may know that day by day we are utterly and absolutely dependent upon him. And the more that we realize that and sense that and live like that, the more that we will experience his grace and his mercy upon us and the joy of the Lord in our hearts. And the Lord also designs that we should live near to him, because that's the best of all ways to live. It's safe there. It's blessed there. It's peaceful there. To know the Lord and to live with him in close fellowship is the best of all possible ways to live. And it's the trials and the sorrows that are so often instrumental in hedging us in to that felt presence of God. If all our lives were just filled with carefree experiences and without any troubles at all, we would so easily and quickly wander away and we would forget the Lord and we would not live with him as we ought to do. But the Lord in his goodness knows how to bring us back, and these trials and these distresses and sorrows are often his way of bringing us to where we need to be and indeed keeping us there. And the other thing, of course, is that these things are designed to sanctify us, to make us more holy. Full of the world's pleasures, full of the world's joys, and off we go into the wild blue yonder, and we not only forget God, but become more like the world in which we live. But the Lord, in his kindness, would have us to be far better and to be far higher in terms of humanity than that. He will make us to be like himself. We would choose a life that is just devoted to this present world. That's what comes naturally. Live for the moment, live for the day. The Lord chooses for us a life that's devoted to him, which is far more fulfilling and far more worthy. And therefore, whatever the Lord ordains for us, the inheritance that he provides for us here in this present life is not something that we should complain over or become resentful about, but we should be glad that he's in control of it all and glad that we can leave him to choose the path for us. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved. There's the story of D.L. Moody, one of the great evangelists of the Victorian age. He was an American. And I've often told this to children, but it bears hearing even though we're not children here tonight. It just illustrates the point so beautifully, I think. D.L. Moody, of course, was as an evangelist, and he travelled a great deal across America, and at least on one occasion, I think more than one occasion, he came over to England, and he preached at the Metropolitan Tabernacle for Spurgeon at one point. And because of all of his travelling, he was away from his family quite frequently and for quite long periods. And it was always his practice, when he came back from one of his long trips, to bring with him a present for his daughter. And that was just the pattern of his life. He wanted to make up for the fact that he'd been away for so long. And then there was one particular trip that he went on, and he was so busy on this trip that he didn't have the time to find a present to bring back for his daughter. So when he got home, he sat his daughter down and explained that, look, I'm sorry, but I didn't bring you a present this time. And to make up for it, what we'll do is to go along to the shops tomorrow and we'll get you something that way. So they went along to a store, and they went to the department that sold the toys. And Moody said to his daughter, now, you have a look around at the dolls. She loved dolls. And he said, you look at the dolls and see which one you'd like. So she looked, and there was this particular doll there with a long white dress on it, and it just stood out from the rest. And she was looking at this, and then she looked at the price, and she said to herself, well, he's never going to spend all that amount of money, so she chose something else. And so they paid for the doll. They got home that night, and Moody was putting his daughter to bed, and he said to her, do you like the doll that we bought today? Are you happy with that? And she said, yes, I'm really happy with it, and thank you for buying it for me. And he said to her, you know, if I'd been you, I'd have chosen the doll with the long white dress. And that made the little girl think. Well, sometime later, the same thing happened. And Moody went away on one of his long trips, and he got so tied up with things that he didn't have time to buy a present for his daughter. And so he came home and he said to his daughter, look, it's happened again, and so what we're going to do is to go down to the shops tomorrow and we'll get you something to make up for it. So after they go to the shops, and they get down to the toy department, and there's this great selection of dolls and everything there, and Moody says to his daughter, now, what would you like? What takes your fancy? And his daughter said to him, remembering what happened last time, Dad, why don't you choose? You choose far better than I do. We would choose, this is the point, we would choose the lesser things. the inferior things, the things that don't work the best for us. Whereas God, in his goodness, chooses nothing but the best. Now, it doesn't sometimes feel like that, but that's the way that it is. And Israel, at this time when the psalm was composed, was full of faith and joyfulness and confidence that God had so appeared for the nation, and he shall choose our inheritance for us, even the excellency of Jacob, and we are thankful for that, that he will choose it for us, and we're not left to choose it for ourselves. Now, is that the way that we can think? That he will choose not only heaven, but what heaven is, and he has chosen the means of getting there, not leaving it to us and struggling and then failing at the end inevitably, and not leaving it to us to choose what our lives should be, but he making the choice for us, because that's the best for us. It will bring us to God and hedge us into him in the most wonderful of ways. And we sit back and we think to ourselves, yes, that's the way that I want it to be, that God would choose all things for me and take the decision about things out of my hands, because what do I know and what can I do? Lord, go on and choose my inheritance for me. It's the way to live, the way to look to the future, and the God in whom we should trust. Amen.